Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. This week, it's time for the Rendezvous, our monthly look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. when it comes to air and space power, plus important national security trends we should be watching around the globe. The headlines have been busy, so there's a lot to discuss. And to be clear, we're recording this on Wednesday, the 2nd of April, so if world events have developed since then, we'll catch that on the next episode. And with that, I'd like to welcome our Washington experts, Laser Lazarski and Sledge Harmer. Laser?
Great to be back.
And Sledge.
Good to see you as always.
We've also got General Houston Slider Cantwell.
Great to be here.
Doug Berkey.
Yay.
And Charles Galbraith.
Hey, great to be back.
And everyone's going to bring some key air and space perspectives. So, Charles, we normally start with a Hill update, but Mitchell Institute hosted Chief of Space Operations General Saltzman last week. It's a big deal anytime we welcome a service chief to the office. And by the way, for our listeners, we'll include a link to that in our show notes, and you can always find it on our webpage. But anyhow, getting back to that, what were the main takeaways from General Saltzman's presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. It was, like you said, it was great to have the service chief back with us here in our new building and for a Schriever Space Power series. The biggest takeaway was when he said that, there was a fundamental disconnect between the criticality of what the Space Force is doing and the funding it is receiving, right?
And we've talked about that a lot.
We have talked about that a lot. But it was very, very exciting / worrying. I don't know what the right word is here, but when he said we could take another $10 billion right now, right, in the near term to help kickstart our activities. And for those...
Let's call that heartening, right? To hear the service chief say, not only do we need the funding, but we could actually obligate and spend it in a useful manner right now.
Right. So there's different ways to look at this, and you're absolutely right. Having the service chief be willing to state that that's what they need and that they are able to put that on contract if they were receiving it, that is all very, very exciting. The downside is they haven't gotten it. And thanks to continuing resolutions, spending power has been decreasing over the past couple of years. But bottom line, back to $10 billion is roughly 33% growth from where they are at now. And frankly, that 33% growth could probably continue for the next 3 to 4, maybe even 5 years to get the Space Force spending at where it needs to be to counter the threats and deliver the type of capabilities that, are called for by Congress standing up the Space Force,
Well, and frankly, that any joint force operation relies upon. I mean, space is foundational to how every service employs.
Absolutely. And we need to be able to defend our space assets and hold at risk adversary space assets because they, China in particular, are accelerating at breathtaking, jaw-dropping, mind-boggling. There's been a lot of descriptions about how quickly China is moving out. Another aspect of General Saltzman's comments were that they're going to be releasing the Space Warfighting Strategic Framework in the near future. And when General Deptula asked him about that, he said, for those on the inside, it's not going to be that revolutionary. But what it is a common vocabulary to describe space superiority and the activities that need to occur in order to achieve it. And that's important because we have to normalize the discussion about what is space superiority, how do we achieve it, how do all of the different organizations within the Department of Defense contribute to it, why is it so critical, and what do we need, capabilities, personnel, et cetera, to achieve it. So I'm really looking forward to the release of that document and the discussions that we'll be able to have to help further normalize because of that document.
Yeah. Because, for decades, we've been prohibited from even saying warfighting and space in the same sentence. So the fact that this is coming out with a vocabulary that we can use to describe space warfighting is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so the cat's out of the bag there. We're saying space warfighting, and it's not something that we wanted as the United States, but it's something that our adversaries have brought us to because they are contesting it.
Yeah, exactly. So Laser and Sledge, bring us up to speed on the Hill. Charles described yet another CR. We don't have an FY26 budget request, so what are folks doing? Because we'd normally be flooded with the standard budget hearings at this time of year. What's going on?
I don't know. I was more excited listening about what's going on in space, but we'll go over to the Hill. It's been busy. Matter of fact, I'm sure Sledge and I have been passing each other multiple times on the Hill over the last couple weeks, Congress focused on getting the government up and running and preparing for FY26 bills. And in politics aside, the first order of business for the Senate with the new administration is to confirm all the new administration nominees and get them into positions across the different federal agencies. Because the country can't, just like the military, we cannot operate on actings. We need appointed and confirmed leaders in all the positions so they can start executing, what is being dictated down to them and what we're going to be doing. And everybody knows it's a messy process. It's subject to holds and filibusters, but the Senate's working its way. There's roughly 1,300 nominees. There's about 64 confirmable positions in DOD. And thank goodness the defense nominees are finally getting hearings. We had the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, Secretary of Navy are all confirmed. And the process was slowed a little bit because you have to have complete paperwork, and the paperwork was not complete, and you can't schedule hearings. But the good thing is we've already had hearings to include Secretary of the Air Force, but on the 27th of March, the 1st of April, so it's a total of 5 there. We've got another 4 coming on 8 April. At the same time, Congress is working to get a budget resolution, and that's just the top line spending numbers and instructions on how we're going to operate this year, how Congress is going to operate. It also includes reconciliation, which we discussed last podcast. And while it's not done yet, it looks like there's going to be some movement in the Senate. So hopefully maybe they'll get a budget resolution done by the end of April or early May. And then simultaneously getting into what you talked about at the very beginning is FY26 bills. So Congress, members, staff, committees are doing everything they can to build the FY26 bills and have them together minus the budget because it hasn't come on over so they can get back on some sort of normal timeline. And the present budget should have been submitted on the 3rd of February. But as with all new administrations, they tend to be late. We're hearing the skinny budget could come over most likely the end of the month. And then we're hearing a full budget the end of May with justification books to follow, possibly in June. So this puts Congress in a bind because they got to hold hearings. They got to have staffer days where the professional staff meet with the subject matter experts to get briefed on all the programs. Then they need to put the bill together in the committee and hold a meeting with all the members so that we can make changes to the bill and then send it to the floor in the House and the Senate. And this is all supposed to happen before the August recess, which we'll see. I think the NDAs will get done, hopefully, but I'm not sure about the approach bills. And then when you add in there all the meetings with industry, nonprofits, business, interest groups, constituents, they've all been up since the beginning of the year through now, and they will be through May. And it just makes a really crazy time on the Hill, but they are moving forward.
Yeah, just a couple things to add. I think, first of all, I know Charles hit on this, the impact of a CR is pretty bad, but the good thing about FY25 full year CR is it's behind us now. It's over. And we can at least look with a little bit more clarity into the future. It's not a traditional CR in legal terms. I mean, there was money added above the FY24 enacted level. It wasn't quite what the 25 budget request was, and it didn't keep up for inflation. So it is a real cut in terms of purchasing power for DOD. There were also authorities that allowed new starts, pretty broad reprogramming authorities that went into that. But I guess the end of all that really is OMB now looks at that full year CR as more of an appropriations bill. And if you remember when General Spain was over on the Hill for his testimony recently, he talked about a $15 billion cut to the Air Force. That would have been if the CR sequester under the Fiscal Responsibility Act last year had come into effect. But the ruling by OMB takes those off the table, and now it's time to move forward with 26. And I agree with the timeline that Laser's laid out there. The only thing I'm not optimistic we're going to have a budget resolution done by the end of April because of the 2-week recess in there and the bickering that's going on back and forth between the Senate Republicans and now more recently the House Republicans, particularly the fiscal hawks that say the Senate said the House big, beautiful bill was dead on arrival in the Senate. The fiscal hawks in the House are now saying that, hey, Senate, you need to go back to the drawing board. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done as we move forward on that. But We will get there. There will be a reconciliation package. And I think to Charles' earlier point about General Saltzman's talk there, this may be the way that the Space Force gets that $10 billion that they need, because I think he very clearly articulated that there's a requirement, that they have the ability to spend the money. And if they were actually paying attention, I think the folks that are working on the reconciliation package will add that money in. So there is hope there.
That's great to hear.
So, gentlemen, can you speak a little bit more about the DoD specifics regarding the CR? I mean, my understanding is basically it's a CR, right? So no new starts, same funding levels, et cetera, except for some exceptions for specific programs that are either identified within the House Appropes or the Senate Appropes, which is followed by a 45-day plan from DoD regarding how they want to spend that. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's essentially correct. So the CR, which is the law, basically said, hey, DoD, here's a full year CR with a couple of policy anomalies. Come back to us with your spend plan in 45 days. And part of that spend plan, if you want to deviate from existing programs, it had whatever deviation or whatever programs you want to do had to appear in either the Senate or the House appropriations mark. So that's what the law says. Now, there was a letter that went over to DOD from Congress. It was signed by Senator McConnell and signed by Congressman Calvert, that basically said, here's a list of the programs that you need to, if you're going to move money or you're going to do other things out of the CR, these are the programs. So DOD has to balance, are they going to take a letter that came over from Republican members of the Congress as a intent of the Congress for any anomalies or any new programs, or are they going to go back to the source documents? I hear that's being answered differently in each of the services, but I don't really have firsthand knowledge of any of the specifics. Laser, anything to add to that?
Just a little bit on, they, minus being a full bill, they did as best they could, short of having a full bill, to include a lot of anomalies and exceptions for DOD. Like number one is flexibility. Everybody wanted, all the leaders wanted additional flexibility in the CR if they were going to have to go on a CR. And it was the first time DOD has ever been on a CR. So they included flexibility for new acquisition starts to procure new weapon systems. They increased transfer authority amounts from $6 to $8 billion. So I think Congress did as much they could, short of getting a bill passed, with everything that you said and Sledge said. But again, this is still a cut. It's still bad for DOD. I think it's worse for the Space Forces, but hopefully through reconciliation, we'll get some additional funding for Space Forces.
And if I could jump in on this, I think one of the biggest frustrations I've got is it's robbing us of time. And right now, the services, all of them, need to ramp to new capabilities and new capacity, and the industrial base also needs to ramp. And this is robbing us of one more year where we're on this kind of austere, steady-state diet with frankly, some hits, because like we said, it's actually a cut. And when we look at what we experienced with Ukraine, trying to scale the munitions build, or if we're looking at trying to scale aircraft builds, or Heather just did the report on the pilot crisis.
Or even starting NGAD, right?
Yeah. We need to ramp these elements, and it is adding tremendous instability. How do you plan for that? And how do you manage risk and all? We're not going to get this year back. And in all accounts, we got to grow. And that is very, very difficult. You really can't make up for it. It takes you X amount of months to produce a pilot or to get raw materials and to increase your line.
Yeah, I'm just going to pile on to what Doug said. When this CR is over at the end of September, the existence of the Space Force will have spent roughly 45% of its time in CR. And so when you have a new service that's predicated on the need to grow, and you can't do that during a CR when your budget spending power is actually decreasing year in and year out because of inflation, it's just no way to create a new service, especially one as critical as we've talked about as the Space Force. Hopefully reconciliation will come through and plus up their bottom line and show a steady increase over the coming years. Hopefully, maybe the Department of Defense prioritization activities might give a little more resources to the Space Force through their spending. But what we absolutely need is consistent passing of defense authorizations so that we can grow the Space Force the way we need to and get out of this habit of relying on continuing resolutions. And I don't want to disagree with our experts here, but to say that the CR is over because it's been passed, we've still got 6 more months to live with it here in fiscal year 25. And we got to do the best we can, hold our breath, and keep plowing forward.
Well, at least one way that Congress is moving forward is within the hearings that Sledge, you and Laser spoke about. For example, the Secretary of the Air Force nominee, Troy Mink, testified last week in his confirmation hearing. Yesterday, we heard from the nominee for the chairman for the Joint Chief of Staff, General Kane. What are your top takeaways there? So, Charles, first we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Slider. But I want to hear from everyone around the table. Yeah,
so Dr. Mink, during his confirmation hearing, he talked about the need to change, to grow the Space Force. I'm going to talk from a space perspective. I know Slider can talk from the air perspective. But the need to grow the Space Force, the need to change and transform. He talked about streamlining the acquisition process to deliver capabilities more quickly. He resonated with the need for space superiority, which of course has been the Space Forces and General Saltzman's main line for quite a while now. And he did voice support for the Sentinel program, which, as we heard from General Chilton's recent paper rollouts, the keys to deterrence or maintaining the nuclear triad. And I love the way he described the legs of the stool being the airborne, the submarine, and the ICBM fleet, but then it's the seat brought together by space capabilities for missile warning and command and control that is absolutely essential.
And by the way, for our audience, we'll include a link to that rollout with General Chilton in our show notes.
All right, fantastic. I really liked a lot of stuff he said. He was threat focused. He talked about being committed to staying ahead of our adversaries, technology, acquisitions. He brings a wealth of knowledge on the acquisitions process and mentioned the importance of making the process more productive and more productive for the warfighter. Some things that caught my attention. He was very supportive of about every program that every congressman wanted to bring up. So it'll be interesting to see as he gets into the job, what does he actually prioritize? There was certainly some concerns about the Air National Guard. What's the future of the Guard? They mentioned that there were 15 squadrons that didn't have any recap plans, so that's going to be certainly put on his plate when he gets in the seat. And then finally, when it comes to the readiness of the force, he made a comment about the KC-135 and how it was zero-timed and practically a brand new aircraft, essentially. And we'll see how that goes moving forward. We all know we've done maintenance on very old aircraft. They're never actually really brand new aircraft until you get a no-kidding brand new aircraft off the assembly line.
Yeah, no, there are structural elements that even if you do a service life extension program, that you really just don't have the ability to address.
Yes. Yeah, if I could jump in there on Slider's point, I think the real question for the new secretary will be is he going to take on the traditional budget allocation battle within the Pentagon? The Air Force needs more than 1/3 of the budget to provide the services and capabilities that they do.
I think it's really interesting, too. If you look at the questions that were asked, what the members are constantly focusing on, a lot on the capacity issues. Slider mentioned the issue about Guard fighter pieces, tankers, and all of that, largely through the composition of who was there with members. We didn't hear a lot about bomber, but clearly it's an issue. I think also we heard people talk very much, Sledge, about that budget point. Now, in many ways, the point of the confirmation hearing is just to get through it. So in many ways, the SecF nominee didn't show a lot of cards, and they're very generalized answers, non-controversial to an extreme at times. There were some softballs that he just let go. I mean, Senator Cotton asked him point blank about pass-through and the need to get that out, and he made a very generalized response, really in a different direction, and he does come from the intel world, so it's hard to know where his cards lay on that. But in our opinion, clearly, they got to fix stuff like that if we're going to see the budgets align how they need to based on the threat and requirements and where we are in the recap phase and personnel. But I think there's a lot unknown. I mean, these are very generalized responses. I mean, in the written responses, I went through them. I mean, he did say some good things. He did say that the department's advantage is shrinking. Overmatch is a concern. He did affirm oldest and smallest on the Air Force fleet. He did talk about the need to really consider space as a contested domain and that we had to be very aggressive on space superiority. It was interesting, too, on those written questions. It was always space first, then air. It's probably the first time we've ever seen that. And maybe that's not a bad thing, but it's just very interesting. It shows its background and how he approaches it.
I'll throw in, those are written back in the building. Obviously, they're his responses, but there's a lot of input into those. And what you said before is right. The hearings are always a circus. It's in front of cameras. And the best meetings that I know Sledge have had and I've had with our bosses is behind closed doors. That's when the real questions get asked, and that's where the real answers come. So each one of those members, not everyone, but most of them, had had a meeting with him beforehand before they ever got into the hearing.
So then, gentlemen, what do you think the members are actually looking for from the SecAF nominee when it comes to executing in today's environment? I mean, did we see that in the hearing itself, those closed door meetings? I mean, what's your sense of where they're at?
First of all, I would say for the hearings, and again, I agree with Laser, they are primarily theatrical in nature there, and it's very parochial for the most part. I mean, you would expect a senator from Missouri to ask what's going to happen at Whiteman. That's just the way it is, and that's the nature of a representative government. The closed-door meetings are where the rubber's really going to hit the road, but I think you could break the expectations down, and I think in partisan views. It's for the Republicans, it's going to be, are you going to support the commander-in-chief? And for the Democrats, it's largely going to be, are you going to be an independent advisor to the president on matters of air and space? And that probably would be about as general as you could get.
Did anyone watch the chairman hearings yesterday? Do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, and I think that not only for the secretary nominee, but for General Kane to be the chairman, again, very parochial line of questioning. I think the Democratic senators made it very clear they do not want the chairman communicating on signal. That was
surprise.
And there's a balance there, too. When you're the principal military advisor to the president, there's a balance between what do you share with the commander-in-chief in private and confidence, and then what you share with our elected officials. The takeaway I had from both the secretary's hearing and yesterday's hearing with General Kane was I thought both of them were extremely well prepared, and competence shows. I thought, unlike some of the other nominees that have more of a business background, subject matter expertise in national security matters really, really came through during their confirmation hearings. And I think both are going to do a spectacular job.
Thank you.
Just following on, and a comment was made is just to get through the hearing. And I agree with Sledge. I thought they did an outstanding job. I didn't see any slip ups, and I thought they came off very knowledgeable and very competent. And you didn't get a lot of the, there was always a standard, well, if confirmed. But I thought both hearings were great. And I also and again, if you look at the defense committees, while there's Republican Democrats and there's disagreements, they tend to be more bipartisan than any of the other committees. And we're focused on one thing, which is national security. And I think that came through despite, there's always going to be disagreements, who's going to ask particular questions. But overall, I thought they were great hearings.
Thank you for that. If there's any point in time that the Department of the Air Force really needs this kind of competent leadership, it's going to be now. All right, folks. So moving down Pennsylvania Avenue, we had a huge announcement in the Oval Office, the F-47. And I'm just going to throw down right now. I think it's going to be called the Golden Eagle. Like that? Anyhow, we referred to it for a long time as NGAD, the Next Generation Air Dominance. And it was an open question whether the Air Force was going to actually pursue this question in the last administration. So what are your all's thoughts on the decision and the events leading up to it? Doug, we're going to start with you and then Slider.
This fundamentally comes down to how do we want to fight as a nation? And if you want to have penetrating air power, you have to have this aircraft. It is all about allowing power projection with manned and unmanned aircraft to go after deep strike targets. And those are the targets you have to go after if you really want to fight and win, because those are the strategic targets. Past that, you are fighting a whack-a-mole campaign, an interdiction campaign. And how do we like that with how Ukraine is performing? Because that's exactly what we'd set ourselves up to do. President Trump emphasized that it does team with the unmanned assets, so CCA, things like that, which is fantastic. I'd expect it to team a lot with B-21 and other assets in theater, F-35, you name it. And so it's a crucial decision. I think that the study that was executed, it certainly drove the calendar further to the right. It drove cost. One benefit of it, though, is that when we've had these very serious questions asked by Elon Musk and others about should we go to a largely unmanned force structure or what's the right ratio, they had their test questions and the responses straight on that. And so I think that was one benefit of it. And for people that really ask about the cost, I would ask, what's the cost of not having it? And again, it just goes to, how do we want to fight and win? And do you want Ukraine, or do you want to have a strategic campaign? It's also really important for key pieces of technology. I mean, if you look at propulsion, if you looked at future information architectures and the backbone of that, sensor capabilities, this is going to carry a lot. Who knows whether it's going to be more like B-21, pulling from existing things, or if it's going to really push state of the art. It's classified, so we'll see as it plays out. But I think from a seismic decision, this is very important.
Yeah, just to pile on to what Doug just said, I think it's great seeing the administration's commitment to air dominance. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of question marks out there. What's the new administration going to look at? So that's fantastic. And then it's also a nod that drones are not going to be the answer to everything in the next chapter. So certainly they're going to be a piece of how we go to war in the future, but we're going to have war fighters that are forward and that can survive in that advanced battlefield.
Yeah, having the human within the battle space is going to be crucial, and it's not just going to be in the B-21, it's going to be in the F-47 as well. Doing that kind of teaming and being able to penetrate to deny sanctuary to our adversaries and provide the administration fundamental options.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From...
Do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To...
He has your eyes. He's perfect.
Learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So, Slazer and Sledge, you're both fighter pilots. So what are your main takeaways from this decision, and how is the Hill receiving the news?
Yeah, obviously the people that support Boeing are doing backflips on this. And there's going to be some, I think, soul searching on the parts of the other companies there and their supporters. But I think it was generally well received. I think at this point, it's probably more important to keep an eye on what the professional staff on the committees are saying and doing. And it's really going to come down to Boeing executing on cost, performance, and schedule. I mean, that's really what Congress is going to be worried about now. The decision has been made. There's going to be some bickering on the edges. It brings the next generation aerospace propulsion into the argument. What are the capabilities going to look like? What's the force structure? Those are the details that Congress is going to start caring about a little bit more now that the big flashy item has been decided, and how do we go forward? And how do we deliver combat options to the commander-in-chief?
Mm-hmm.
Following up on Sledge, I mean, I worked the long-range precision bomber when, before it was the B-21, and that's exactly what we were looking at. We were looking at how are we going to execute, and then it's the funding. And this is the issue, is that as we're trying to do everything else, what happens with the funding to NGAD? And it go back to F-35. How many F-35s are we going to build? How many NGAD? How many F-47s are we going to build? And do we have the budget? And then what happens after the 4 years and we have a different administration? What happens to the program? And that's always been the concern. I always used to joke that no program lasts more than two chiefs of staff. The first one likes it, second one puts up with it, the third one tries to kill it. We don't want to do that with the F-47. Of course, even with the F-35, are we going to build the amount that we need? Are we going to build enough B-21s? And it really, and Sledge has probably hit this home more than anybody, it comes down to budget and what are we going to prioritize?
Well, Lazier, bring up a really good point regarding how this impacts other combat Air Force programs, especially since the Air Force is in a period where it's having to recapitalize darn nearly its entire force structure. I mean, this is going to impact F-35, F-15EX, B-21, CCA. How do you all see this coming to fruition?
Yeah, I'll say Boeing's got their work cut out for them.
Yeah, they got to deliver.
Sledge mentioned just the ability to make the airplane do what they say it's going to do, but then to also integrate it into all the systems that are also coming online. That integration is going to be challenging at levels that we've never seen before. And then I just got to throw in a plug for the tankers, because that plane, just looking at the size of it, ain't going to have the range we need. So it's going to have another bill on the tanker fleet, which is a huge challenge moving forward.
But that's also a reason why we have to remain committed to the next generation propulsion program, right? Because the efficiencies and the performance that engine will bring to the future fleet will be able to make up for some of the range and for the fuel consumption.
I just say, when we talk about the F-47 coming out, one thing that is obviously disturbing, and like everybody said, it comes down to budget, or what's your offset? So everybody talks about, well, are we going to curtail F-35 or F-15EX, or what's going to happen to the B-21 number or CCA? The answer really is you have to have all of them. We've taken such a procurement holiday and reduced the build rates so dramatically across the board that we have to get healthy now. Our mission areas really, really get too thin. We're already there. It's going to get worse. And you just look at the numbers. They say it all. I mean, this last year, the last budget that went across from President Biden, I mean, the Air Force was looking to retire 250 aircraft, only buy 91. You look across the FIDEP, the 5-year plan, they're looking at retiring over 1,000 aircraft, and they're only going to buy a couple hundred. This is not sustainable. That's a death spiral. You look at where we are in modernization, only 28% of the fighters are 5th-gen stealthy aircraft, 14% of bombers. We've got to turn that curve. And CCA is absolutely essential. You know, we're bestowing the virtues of F-47, and that's great. But CCA is going to be absolutely crucial for bringing the capacity and certain mission performance attributes in ways in which manned aircraft can't do it. And you've got to get those in volume. And we've asked a lot out of industry, leading in with IRAD and other things and bringing in new entrants like Anduril. The worst possible thing you could do is pull back those numbers and that commitment, because it would have a generational chilling effect on industry's willingness to commit. And so this is something where we have to keep advocating for the necessary funding. And we've taken a break for too long. It is time to catch up. And you look at something like the F-35, we're going to be replacing F-16s for at least 2 decades out into the future. You have to replace them with something. I don't think there's ever going to be anything with as much performance and as low of a relative cost point as the F-35 for a heck of a long time. We don't want to curtail that option too early.
Yeah, Doug, if I could actually hit on something you said there for the offset. So this gets back to my comment about the Secretary's confirmation hearing. The offset shouldn't come from the Air Force top line. We need to look across the enterprise, either get additional resources through reconciliation or wherever, but look across the DoD enterprise. Does the Army need to build a LEO proliferated constellation? No. Do they
Space
need
Force for that?
Do they need long-range precision strike? That's the role of the United States Air Force. So I think a little bit of discipline into the roles and missions of the services will solve some of those vexing problems about how do we make sure that we have the right capacity and the capability to fight the joint fight.
No,
Well,
absolutely.
To pile on to what both of you have said, I mean, we are building our future systems to be integrated, interoperable, and dependent upon each other. And if you don't buy the entire family of systems, you weaken every single member of that system. So if you send a B-21 into bad guy land without the appropriate space satellite constellations, without the appropriate CCA, without F-47, you are decreasing its mission effectiveness because you aren't fielding the entire family of systems in the way that we designed, required, and envisioned those operational concepts. So you have to be able to buy the entire family of systems, because as important as information is, if you don't have a physical platform in the battle space to affect whether that's kinetic or non-kinetic, you really aren't going to be delivering hurt to the adversary.
No, and if we're worried about
Look at just one other thing. I mean, when I see combat aircraft, we've said, okay, we need tankers, we need transports. How are we doing on the T-7?
Oh.
All right. And it gets into what Sledge and others have said. We've got to perform. Boeing's got to perform on NGAD, the F-47. We have to be able to procure and build and field aircraft on time and on budget.
Which also actually brings up an important point of not being overly technologically optimistic. So a huge element of the schedule for T7 was predicated on digital engineering, which is absolutely the direction that we have to be able to go in the model-based systems engineering. But we cannot jump all the way into the deep end without having the appropriate processes in place to back that up and mature the technology at the right rate with the effectiveness and to be able to do that regarding the maturity of the system.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's actually an easy solution to that. When you look at the cost, performance, and schedule Venn diagram, you need to put more emphasis on schedule than you do on performance. And that will get you away from, you say, okay, this is the date, I've got it, I'm going to snap the chalk line, this is the date it's got to go. So give me something that I can field on this date.
And when you look at modernization programs, that means you focus more on the hardware. You focus more on the aircraft and the propulsion, while building in the swap C capabilities to be able to upgrade the sensors, the avionics, and the weapon systems at the time that they mature organically. I mean, that's how it has to be done to maintain that schedule, but create the options for future growth for performance.
And I'd just say the other thing we really need to pay attention to, if we're worried about stretching our dollar, being efficient and all that, one of the most expensive things you can do is sink billions and billions in innovating technology, but never actually manifest the full buy. It's tremendous cost imposition for low rate of return. I mean, would you build a house, live in it for 2 weeks, and then just walk away from it, build another? It's nuts. But that's what we did on B-2, F-22. It's what we could do on F-35 if we don't do the full build.
It's a great story. If you ever, a short story by Albert C. Clark called Superiority. And it's about the argument of quantity over quality. And at some point, you can have the greatest widget, but if it takes you forever to develop it, the enemy can overwhelm you with mass and defeat you.
Yeah, and when you look at time as the new offset, as well as the scale and the scope of the geography that we will have to face within the Pacific, while also taking care of all the motherhood and our security commitments around the rest of the globe, we have to have that capacity. So we've seen a lot of diplomatic turbulence regarding U.S. arms exports given the recent decisions and discourse from the Trump administration. What are your thoughts from the team?
Well, I just say to kick this off, it's really important that everybody focus on the long-term game here. There are countries with which we have fundamental aligned interests and values, and I think those are going to outweigh any particular position of a given administration. And so it is crucial that we look at trying to sustain certain norms and relationships to ensure that we have the ability to fight and win as a team. Because right now, our capacity and capabilities as a military are such that we have to have those players. It was kind of optional whether we did that at the end of the Cold War. If you look at how we fought Desert Storm or something now. If you want to go in today, you have got to have that team with you. And we need to be very, very careful that we don't blow it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the space side, we've heard senior leaders time and time again talk about the need for a strong coalition, how that's one of our greatest tools in the toolkit is that we go to war as a coalition. The term allied by design has come across multiple times. And so building capabilities in a cooperative way, sharing technologies, absolutely. And Doug, just to reemphasize on your opening point, we've got to think about the bigger picture. What are our interests? I hope that our adversaries, right, China, Russia, I'm talking to you, don't look at the disagreements on the margins as a weakness in the overall coalition, because when push comes to shove, we will circle our wagons and we'll kick the crap out of you.
After spending a couple years as a commander in NATO, I just want to throw a NATO lens on this. The United States has played a very important leadership role when it comes to the organizing, training, and equipping of the NATO countries. And I want to hit on what Sledge said earlier about there are very parochial interests and there are very local interests when it comes to here in the United States. You hear each state is pushing for their base to grow, their capability to grow. Well, that's what you have in NATO. If you remove the United States leadership, you have 32 individual countries that are fighting for their own individual equities with no one guiding the entire unit. And so the United States has played a critical role in that. If we walk away from that, there's going to be a lot of instability across NATO.
Well,
and I just want to add one other point, too. These alliances and the organizations, those are a product of World War II and us winning the Cold War. We need to be very, very careful before we give some of that up, because you will never get it back again. We do not exist in that world. And things are very different. And we probably could not, we don't have the sway to reconstruct it again. They were fundamentally built in our interest, and we need to be very, very careful.
But we've also seen, because of some of the turbulence that's gone on, some wavering commitment to continuing to procure U.S. systems, right? Like F-35 is probably the headline one that a lot of folks are hand-wringing about. Sledge and Laser, how's the Hill responding to this? Because I can't imagine that members are really thrilled with the thought of contracts being on the line or losing some of these purchases through FMS or other commercial sales.
I think there's a couple things at play here. First is the national security policy and the implications in that regard. I know that the president's about to issue an executive order that will probably open the aperture for increased foreign military sales. There's talk about increasing the congressional notification levels, which would make it easier to get cases through and quicker. So it's about expediting that. I think at the end of the day, the administration wants to build everything in America, and we will tailor the national security interests with the economic interest that comes with having robust manufacturing and arms exporting. So I think that's the direction that the administration will go. Congress will generally support that. There are going to be some people that put roadblocks up for specific countries and for specific reasons, but that's part of the deal. Congress can also always pass a joint resolution of disapproval to stop a FMS case. I don't think in history there's ever been a successful one, even in recent history, what's going on in the Middle East. So I think that's kind of the direction for arms exports. I think tariffs are a bigger issue that probably need to be considered a little bit more. And that will have, I think, at least right now you're hearing some rumblings out of Europe, will have a more chilling effect on willingness. And this may be a tit for tat. Once we normalize tariffs, a lot of these arguments will go away. But my opinion on the way the administration is doing this is we are $37 trillion in debt. If we don't do something about cutting the size of the government, and in the cases where we have a trade deficit, we do something to address that through fair trade, not free trade, then the long-term viability of the United States is at question. And I've said it on this podcast, 100 times. Military power is based on economic power. And that's really what the president's trying to do here. And I think Congress will support that.
Well, an onshoring manufacturing capability is absolutely essential because I do not believe that you can be a superpower if you are fundamentally a service-based economy.
Just jumping on the first on the arms sales during the first Trump administration, I would say he was frustrated most of the time by Congress because they kept delaying or denying foreign arms sales for a variety of reasons. It wasn't always consistent, but so everything he tried to do, he was always getting slowed down. So that's why, as Sledge said, you're going to see an executive order that maybe by the time this podcast comes out, that'll ease the rules for exporting military equipment and different sales. And then obviously getting to what you said was it's going to help our defense contractors and making sure that we produce more here in the United States. And National Security Advisor Waltz, when he was a congressman, he was the one that initially tried to do this over in the House with legislation that Sledge was talking about, increasing the dollar amounts that would trigger a notification to Congress. On the for the congressional side, there really hasn't been a uniform challenge to any of the policy changes that have been out there, but the voices are starting to get a little louder. Some of them are coalescing, especially on the NATO front that we were talking about at the beginning. But really, time's going to tell, and time will also tell, I think, on the tariffs. And I think Sledge has it right. There's going to be some tit for tat, but it's ultimately going to level out at a place where, again, President Trump is trying to get us in a better place than we are right now. Where that is, I don't know what it is, but I do believe it'll level out. And then that will play into the arms sales going back to what we are usually used to. But there are it is forcing our allies and our partners to relook at their own national security capabilities and what the future engagement with the U.S. should be or will be like.
I would just issue one caution for the allied leaders that are pretty sure right now in their protests and threaten to pull contracts. They delayed procurement for so long that their inventories are so fragile that if they give up those line production slots, think F-35 or something like that, everybody else is surging orders too. And they could be surrendering years. And so they need to be very careful how far they push those threats. We had an air chief in recently, I'll leave unnamed, but their force is so fragile, it's terrifying. And years really matter on that. 1 or 2 years would be very, very
Could
bad.
break their force.
Yeah. And so they need to be careful that they don't allow the political churn and that froth and what they're saying to their domestic audience to save face in many ways. They don't want to undermine what they really need to maintain viable power.
So in addition to the CR and everything else that's going on the Hill with the nomination hearings, we're also hearing from the Vice CISO, General Gutlein, Air Force Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Lieutenant General of Spain, talking about readiness for their forces. So what were your takeaways when you listened to these leaders?
Yeah, I was really interested in hearing what Elmo had to say about readiness. There are a few officers I respect more than him. We actually flew T-41s together back at Hondo as cadets. So I followed Elmo around for many years. But he started off his testimony using words from the Mitchell Institute. We are the oldest, smallest, and then he seriously deviated. He said, we are not the least ready. And so that really caught my attention. I wanted to listen to what he had to say to back up, we are not the least ready. And I had some concerns because, well, on the good side, he said in terms of recruitment, Air Force is doing very well. And so that was great news to hear. But in terms of aircraft readiness, there were some concerning lines that I heard. Number one, 340 additional aircraft are on the ramp due to lack of spare parts. He said, for the last several years, our flying hour program has been set to executable levels instead of the actual requirement that's needed to keep the force mission ready. And he also said, we continue to set the bar lower and lower every year. And so those facts still cause me great concern about the readiness levels of our Air Force.
Let me jump on that too. If you look at this trend line that we've been following for years, when the budget's getting tighter and the demands are surging, there's a past chief in the 2010s who said, it's going to be okay to get smaller because we're going to be better capabilities and going to be more ready. We've lost every single way around. We are smaller, we're older, and we're less ready. I mean, this is not good. You can cheat one or two of those. You cannot cheat them all at the same time.
Well, I think from an adversary perspective, it's important to acknowledge that we still have the competencies and the capabilities within the service that we could surge that readiness if we needed to, because we still have the experienced aviators, we still have robust maintenance, but we're on a precipice. And I think that that's what we're really cautious about at the Mitchell Institute, is saying, hey, look, we need to make sure that we husband this capability so that we don't become a hollow force.
Or on the side of the Space Force, never grow out of being a hollow force, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask Charles, so in space, how do we measure readiness from both a weapon system capability and an operator capability?
Well, so there's multiple levels. And I'll say that the delivery of the needed services and effects that the joint community has relied on for decades, that's continuing. The thing is, without the ability to gain and maintain space superiority, all of that comes into question. And so we know that there are threats out there. We've got to be able to address those threats and defend, but it's not just about defense. It's also about offense, because we don't want the adversary to have those same advantages. And so as General Gutlein talked about, we need to accelerate in order to transform the Space Force into the warfighting service that it needs to be. The mission requirements are outpacing the funding. And so it's a very similar but sort of other side of the coin problem to the readiness issue facing the Air Force. We absolutely need the budget. We need steady growth in order to build the capabilities that we absolutely need.
Well, and Charles, you're the expert. I mean, but one area that when you're talking, I think about is the virtual training ranges. On the air side, I mean, we pride ourselves about red flag, and this is great and all, and go fly your mock missions to increase your odds of survival. Right now, Guardians, we don't have the money to build those out yet, or they're undersized where they should be. And so these things are going to happen. Space is contested. It is every day. And we've got to empower these Guardians for success. If we don't have the cash to back them for that build and get them that training, this is nuts.
So what blew my mind was learning that for most Guardians, their warfighting skill sets are on-the-job training because you don't have those virtual training ranges.
Yeah, absolutely. We need the virtual training ranges to develop the skills, because there are some things, some threats that we don't actually want to do.
Yeah, no,
right?
Exactly. It's a lot like a lot of our war reserve modes or other classified capabilities.
Exactly.
We don't want to use in open air. We don't want to demonstrate it where it can be observed.
Right. So we need the virtual training grounds. And it also helps us with the reps and sets, because real world exercises are expensive. You can get multiple iterations through virtual training. So that's absolutely critical.
And also the maneuvering piece, right? Because if you maneuver, you use up fuel and you don't, you can't do that just for giggles.
Yeah, and we can go on and on and on about the need to maneuver.
You proud of us, Charles? We actually listened to you.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I just want Congress to make sure that they listen too, because we need more money for the Space Force, and we can go on and on about that.
So let's talk about space superiority and the offensive capabilities, because we saw headlines the other week about Chinese space assets dogfighting. I use that in air quotes, right? In orbits.
Air quotes.
Yeah. Okay, space quotes. Does that make you feel better?
It does. Thank you.
All right. Can you actually describe what they mean by space dogfighting, and what that significance is? Because it probably, we know it plays into the imperative that we heard from General Saltzman regarding space superiority.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple different things I want to talk about when it comes to space dogfighting. First is what General Gutlein originally described was 5 Chinese satellites simultaneously doing maneuvers around one another and exercising tactics to gain a superiority edge, dogfighting in space. 5 satellites in the same vicinity operating at roughly the same time. That's a huge step forward. Typically, when we think about rendezvous and proximity operations, right, getting 2 objects close together and then maneuvering around each other, it's typically 2, right? China is now demonstrating 5. And so whether that's 4-on-1 or 3-on-2 or 2-on-2 with an observer, I don't know. But it's a huge step forward, and it's an indication of where China is really leaning forward in their aggressive behavior and in their ability to contest the space domain. Now, is dogfighting the right term? I heard from a lot of my astrodynamics friends saying, hey, we need to make sure that people don't get the wrong idea. This isn't Star Wars or Star Trek with, right? And that's absolutely right. But it is a useful analogy because it helps people get their minds around the subject of contesting the space domain. And just to throw this out there, General Saltzman talked about it when he was with us here at the Mitchell Institute, and he talked about 2-circle.
I was so proud of him.
That was great. That was great. But so for space dogfighting, doing a circle takes you 24 hours at GEO, right?
Wow.
So this is not lightning fast activities like you associate with science fiction or what you see in the air domain. It might be closer to undersea warfare. I don't think they call it dogfighting when submarines go after each other. It's just undersea warfare. So space warfare, that's what China is practicing.
It was pretty cool in Hunt for Red October around the caverns.
Well, it sure was. It sure was. But so it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's a good one. And General Saltzman relayed his support for it as well. And I think it's important for our audience to understand the objective here of using terms like dogfighting is to help normalize the understanding of what's going on in space. This is aggressive behavior. It's similar to what we've seen in other domains. It's not a perfect analogy. No analogy ever is. Otherwise, it'd be the same thing, right? So it is useful in helping to articulate what is going on, even though there are some considerable differences, particularly in the time.
So that wasn't the only development that we had in space recently. So we saw a lot of activity in commercial space, including another successful lunar landing and even another private crewed space flight, but this one in polar orbit. So are these just stunts, or do they mean something that's much more significant?
So I think it's a clear indication of the speed and the breadth of the commercial space sector. Both of these activities, the lunar lander, Blue Ghost, so a commercial entity landing on the moon successfully with scientific payloads, that's a phenomenal achievement. This is the second launch, but FRAM-2, second launch of a private or commercial astronauts. That's a milestone in and of itself. The fact that they are going into polar orbit, which is the first time humans have gone into polar orbit, period. And it's a commercial or private sector. So they're really advancing the state of the art, really, for what can be done in space. And so I think this is just an indication of how the Space Force and United States Space Command can leverage some of the great work that is rapidly developing out of the commercial sector. These are just great examples.
It's exciting to see that kind of innovation happening in the commercial space. And also then on the space launch front, we had ULA's Vulcan certified, plus Rocket Lab and Stoke Space also received good news for the government. Bring us up to speed on launch developments.
Yeah, so for the longest time, SpaceX Falcon 9 was the national security space launch option for the Space Force. ULA's Vulcan rocket got certified after its second successful launch back in October, so it took about 5 months to get certified. But now we have 2 launch providers, which is great. It reminds me back in the day when we had ULA that had Atlas and the Delta rockets, so two different providers. We also have Blue Origin with New Glenn that has done one launch. They need to do another and then go through the certification process. Rocket Lab's Neutron and Stoke Space's Nova rockets. Both of them are medium class rockets that are both reusable, aiming to reduce the cost of launch overall.
So, Charles, medium class, what does that mean regarding payload and orbit?
So Stoke is roughly 3,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit, and Rocket Lab's Neutron is going to be about 13,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. So they could launch a suite of Starlink satellites the same way that the Falcon has. So it's another opportunity. And so you might be thinking, man, you just described 5 different launch providers in the medium class area. Is that too many? Don't forget, launch is hard. We saw recently a failure out of Norwegian launch, so it's great that our European allies are looking to launch from Europe, but that was a launch failure. Launch is hard. And for those that can remember, SpaceX, when it was starting out, it had a series of launch failures. So having multiple vendors out there that can launch from multiple sites, including Wallops and Kodiak and others, is a phenomenal boon to the United States launch market because, as I wrote about last year, launch is the absolutely critical first element of space superiority.
And if
you
we
can't get
into,
there, you can't control it.
Yeah, and if we get into a hot space fight, we would need to be able to launch to reconstitute some constellations.
Reconstitution is a potential use for more rapid launch. There are others that think that we don't want to have satellites waiting in the barn. Augmentation is going to be critical in terms of surging capability as part of a buildup, potentially before a crisis as a show of force. So, yeah, but absolutely. Having a robust launch infrastructure is just absolutely critical to national security.
So then this begs our final question for today, because it's been a great session. We heard that there was turbulence in the Space Development Agency contracts. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so this came up during Dr. Mink's testimony. Congress asked him, hey, what do you think of the Air Force's plan to cancel some Space Development Agency Tranche 2 and Tranche 3 transport layer satellites? And he said, first of all, no decision has been made. He's going to look into it. But what I really liked about his answer was he advocated for the need for competition and for a broader industrial base. We talk about a lot about tech billionaires these days, and some people draw the analogy to the Industrial Revolution and the robber barons that were created there. Let's not forget that some of those robber barons got their money and kept their money through monopolistic approaches. And having a robust competition base where there's more than one provider is absolutely critical to capitalism. How about that, right? And so we need to be embracing that across the board.
Well, and let's just also say that those kinds of choices not only create the competition to lower costs, but it gives us more resilience across our entire architecture, operational agility, and so forth. So there's goodness to having those choices.
Absolutely.
Everyone, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a great session, and we'll talk to you the next time on The Rendezvous.
Always good to be here.
Everybody have a great April, and we'll see you next podcast.
Thanks, Lucky.
Thanks, Heather. Great to be with you.
Hey, appreciate it.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great aerospace power kind of day. See you next time.
Okay, so I've got your end story here. So, guys, on Monday night, I was delayed at Logan Airport in Boston, trying to come back to town due to storms, and I ended up getting in the house around 2 a.m. And I wake up the next morning, and I'm pretty groggy, and I'm not all there, and it's April 1st. And all of a sudden, phone rings, and I look, and it's a text, and we had just hung on Friday a massive industrial size Mitchell Institute logo. Metal.
It's like 150 pounds. And I'll tell you, if you want to have a good time, you need to crack open a cold one and watch Doug and Dep Tula hang things
was
around
quite
the
entertaining.
office. Yeah, you know, I mean, it's interior decorators, right? It's like they're interior decorators and contractors.
How many general officers does it take to decorate the Mitchell office? Actually, multiple. We found out on Friday.
Yeah.
So, we hang this thing up, and this is not light. And I was actually going to come back and secure it a little bit better to some studs.
Yeah, there was a dispute.
Yeah.
Should we mount this thing in the drywall or should we actually find the stud?
Yeah. So I was going to come back and revisit. So
you were supervising? Is that it, Slider?
I was.
So I get this picture, and Slider always comes in the office early, and he's standing in front of the logo on the ground, and there are these huge gash marks in the wall, screws pulled out and everything. And I just got to be honest, the combination of having like 3 hours sleep compared to how things are going in DC generally right now, I just go, oh shit, okay, I got it. One more thing to fix, and you can see a flat spot in the sign where this thing is dented the metal, and I'm just already thinking, okay, rubber mallet, I'm gonna get some blocks of wood, we can work out this thing. I have just bought this thing hook, line, and sinker because it's a metaphor for how a lot of stuff has been going recently in DC. And all of a sudden, I hear
5
somebody,
minutes later.
start to laugh who was in on the joke. And so credit to Slider with his Photoshop skills. They're pretty impressive.
April Fool's, Doug.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I'm glad it was just a joke.
Well,
we might want to go check it right now.
Yeah.
If it falls, it's going to be when like 10 people are standing right next to it. And we are going to reinforce it for everybody's sake. So there you go.